Welcome to the Feminist Park podcast. I'm Kwame.
And I'm Leilani. It's great to be kicking off this journey with you all today.
Yeah, we're diving into work that's really closely tied to the vision behind the Feminist Park project.
Imagining these truly equitable public spaces, starting with the idea for an intersectional feminist park right here in Berlin.
Exactly. And this podcast, well, it's kind of an extension of that. We're going to be digging into the academic research that, supports and informs that kind of vision.
We'll be taking these dense, sometimes quite academic papers and really pulling out the core and insights.
And looking at them through specific lenses, things like environmental justice, intersectionality, anti-colonial thought, queer theory.
All the stuff that helps us think critically about space.
When you look at a city map, you usually just see the concrete, you see the water pipes, the transit lines.
Right, the grids.
Exactly, the formal arteries of commerce. But what you do not see is this giant, invisible nervous system of human care.
Oh, absolutely.
You don't see the unseen, exhausting routes a mother takes to get her kids to school safely. Or, you don't see the specific park bench that an elderly man relies on just to have someone to talk to.
Yeah, or the makeshift spaces marginalized people carve out just to survive the week.
Right. So today we're going to look at how physical space dictates who survives, who thrives, and who is systematically excluded. Welcome to the Deep Dive.
It's so great to be here. Because it is entirely too easy to walk through a city and just see buildings and roads, right? To see the physical matter of our urban environments as neutral.
Like it's just a backdrop.
Exactly. But space is never neutral. It is an active participant in our lives. It shapes how we live, how we connect, and most importantly, how we care for one another.
And that brings us to our mission for today. For you, the listener, we are going to analyze two absolutely fascinating academic articles, and our goal is to extract the mechanisms, the lived experiences, and the data from them to inform a really specific theoretical framework.
It's a massive design challenge.
It is. We are conceptually designing something called the Feminist Park today. We want to figure out, if you were handed a blank blueprint, how do you actually design urban spaces for true liberation, equity, and care?
It's ambitious, but we have incredibly rich source material to guide us on this.
We really do. We have two distinct sources on the table today, and they were both published in 2026. The first is a paper examining Bogotá, Colombia, specifically their district care system.
Yeah.
It's titled Care Networks as Unanticipated Gains of Local Public Policy by Alvarez Rivadula and a team of researchers. And then the second source takes us literally across the globe to pandemic-era Sydney, Australia.
A completely different environment.
Totally. That one is titled Public Spaces as Infrastructures of Care, Mundane Doings of / in Ordinary Places by Williams and colleagues.
So we have two vastly different cities, two very different socioeconomic contexts, yet there are these striking similarities in what they reveal about the fundamental human need for spatial infrastructure.
Yeah, it's wild how the themes overlap. Now, before we really get into the weeds, I do want to make a quick note to you, the listener, because these sources touch on some intensely politically charged events.
I definitely do.
We are going to be discussing pandemic lockdowns, public health mandates, policing strategies, global migration. And our goal today is absolutely not to endorse any specific government policies or, to take political sides on these lightning rod issues.
Right. We're not here to debate the politics of it.
Exactly. We're here strictly to unpack and impartially report on the lived experiences and the data presented by the researchers in the original source material. So we're just observing how the researchers frame these events as either barriers to or facilitators of care.
Exactly. Because the value of this knowledge lies in understanding human behavior and urban mechanics. We're looking at the sociology and the geography of these specific moments in time to understand how infrastructure either supports or, completely fails its most vulnerable residents.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because I always like to say, think of the city not just as concrete and pipes, but as a giant invisible nervous system of care. Where are the pinched nerves and where are the healthy synapses? Let's start with Bogotá, Colombia, using the research from Alvarez Rivadula et al., 2026.
Let's do it.
So in 2020, the local government launched an initiative called the District Care System, or CLIU. And at the heart of this system are these physical installations called care blocks, or manzanas del cuidado.
Such a fascinating concept.
Right, and they were inserted right into existing public infrastructure in vulnerable, underserved areas of the city. The entire policy is built around what they call the 3 Rs.
Recognizing, redistributing, and reducing.
Exactly. Recognizing, redistributing, and reducing women's unremunerated or unpaid care burden.
And to really understand why this is so radical, we have to look at the baseline statistics the researchers provide regarding the burden of time. Because time is everything here.
Yeah, give us the context.
So globally, women perform 76.2% of all unpaid care work.
Wait, 76%?
Yeah, they dedicate 3.2 times more time to it than men. And in Bogotá specifically, women spend 2.5 hours more per day on care than men do.
Wow.
It gets heavier. A full 30% of all adult women in Bogotá are full-time caregivers, meaning they care for others more than 6 hours a day without any financial compensation.
6 hours a day? That's a full-time job.
It is. And only 8% of men fall into that category. So when the city introduces the 3 Rs, they're targeting a massive systemic imbalance in how time itself is distributed.
Okay, I understand the theoretical appeal of the 3 Rs, right? Like, recognizing means making the invisible work visible. Redistributing is about shifting the burden off of one person's shoulders. And reducing means lowering the actual hours spent on the tasks. But I have to push back here for a second. Because we've all seen grand urban renewal projects. A city builds a shiny new community center, they cut a ribbon, and they say it's going to fix systemic inequality.
Right, the classic political photo op.
Exactly. So how does putting a communal laundry machine next to a high school classroom actually change the social fabric? It sounds like a nice amenity, I mean, sure, but I'm skeptical that a laundromat dismantles the patriarchy. What did the researchers actually observe?
That is a vital distinction to make, and the researchers went in asking exactly that question. They conducted extensive ethnographic observation, focus groups, and interviews with over 100 people in Bogotá.
So they were really on the ground.
Very much so. And what they found is that the physical proximity of these services is the exact mechanism that makes the difference.
How so?
Well, think about it. If a city just offers a class somewhere, but a woman has to commute an hour to get there, and she still has to do all the household laundry by hand when she gets back, she just won't go to the class.
Because she literally does not have the currency of time to spend on it.
Precisely. Time poverty is absolute. But in a care block, the services are stacked.
Stacked, okay.
Yeah. So a woman can drop off her children at the professionally staffed childcare center, then put her family's clothes in the communal washing machine. And while the machine is running, she just walks down the hall to take a class to finish her high school diploma.
Oh.
Or perhaps she sees a psychologist or takes a legal consultation. The physical collocation of services is what reduces the temporal burden.
Because she's doing 3 things at once, essentially.
Right. There was one woman the researchers spoke to who walks an hour and a half from a rural peripheral area just to use the block. And she told them that the laundry service was an absolute blessing.
Just the laundry service alone.
Yes, because hand-washing clothes is physically destructive. It's exhausting, and it delays every other aspect of her life.
So by providing the machine, the state is literally handing her back 3 hours of her life.
Yes, and that leads directly to the first R, recognition. By dedicating prime public real estate and actual funding to these specific tasks, the state is officially validating that this domestic work is heavy labor.
It isn't just, something women do out of love.
Right. And the researchers noted a profound psychological shift because of this. Women who attended the care blocks started to identify as caregivers with a deep sense of pride. They repeatedly heard women saying, "Somos cuidadoras," we are caregivers.
Somos cuidadoras. I love that. That isn't just a statement of fact, that's a political identity.
Absolutely.
It's stepping out of the shadow of, well, I'm just a stay-at-home mom, and actually claiming a recognized status.
And they learned to question the patriarchal distribution of labor that conditioned them to accept this invisible status in the first place.
Did any of the respondents speak to that specifically?
Yeah, one respondent, a woman in her late 50s who went to the care block to finally finish her high school education, she told the researchers, and I'm paraphrasing here, but she said, "We learned to recognize and value ourselves, to know our worth as women. We are not just here to serve the household."
That is an incredible personal awakening. But let's dig into the other 2 Rs, reducing and redistributing.
Right.
Because, did the policy actually change the domestic dynamic? You can put a diaper-changing class in a community center, but you're fighting centuries of deeply ingrained machismo culture.
Very true.
A poster on a wall isn't going to make a husband suddenly do the dishes. So if the state takes the kid for 2 hours, does the husband at home actually step up?
The researchers from Alvarez-Rivadula et al. Looked very closely at this, and the reality is fascinating.
I have a feeling I know where this is going.
You probably do.
Yeah.
The short answer is no, the men generally did not step up.
Shocker.
Right. Reorganizing care on a societal level requires forming what sociologists call caring masculinities. And Bogotá actually tried to engineer this. They set up classes inside the care blocks, specifically for men. It was an initiative called Care is Learned a Cuidar se Aprende. They literally held state-sponsored workshops to teach men how to cook, wash clothes, sweep, iron, and change diapers.
A state-sponsored class to teach adult men how to sweep?
Yes.
I have to imagine the uptake on that was, slow.
Very slow. The researchers observed very low attendance by men. And during the interviews, only a small handful of women reported that their male partners became more involved in household chores. Most partners continue to avoid care responsibilities entirely.
So the patriarchal structure inside the home remained completely intact. The husband is still sitting on the couch.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
So the redistribution of labor didn't happen horizontally between women and men. It happened vertically between women and the state.
Oh, that's a huge distinction.
Yes. The state bypassed the husbands entirely and became the co-caregiver.
Okay, here is where I want to pause and put a pin in our blueprint for the feminist park, because this is a really counterintuitive insight. The massive, progressive feminist policy failed to change men's behavior, yet it succeeded wildly anyway because it provided robust physical state infrastructure to take their place.
Right.
The women didn't have to wait for a cultural revolution in the living room to get relief. They just went to the state.
Exactly. And ironically, many women reported being functionally busier than before.
Wait, really?
How? Because now they had their home duties, their paid work if they managed to find it in the informal economy, and they were trying to squeeze in going to the care block to get their high school diploma or take a Zumba class. Their schedules were tighter.
Oh, I see. But they still reported massive satisfaction with the program, right?
Right.
Why? If they're busier, why are they happier?
Because that extra time at the care block, even if it required intense scheduling acrobatics, was time spent on themselves.
Right.
It was a complete paradigm shift. For decades, they were taught that absolute self-sacrifice was their only value.
Right.
Prioritizing their own well-being, prioritizing their own education, it was an act of profound rebellion.
There is a specific anecdote from the Alvarez-Rivadula paper that perfectly illustrates this, and honestly, I haven't been able to stop thinking about it since I read it.
Oh, respondent 11.
Yes. Respondent 11. She's a woman in her late 60s, and she had worked making garments from her home for over 30 years.
30 years of isolation.
Exactly. 3 decades of absolute isolation from her community, just sewing in a room. And then she started going to the care block.
Yeah.
And she told the researcher something like, on Thursdays, there are some activities to learn how to ride a bike. And well, I don't know how to ride one. It makes me very nervous. It scares me. So I'm thinking about joining the group to see if maybe I can give it a try.
It's an incredibly poignant moment in the research. I mean, here's a woman in her late 60s stepping out of a lifetime of domestic confinement and deciding to prioritize a moment of joy.
Yes, just physical freedom.
Exactly. Learning a new skill purely for herself. Self-care in this context is absolute liberation. It completely dismantles the patriarchal expectation that her life is merely a resource to be consumed by her family.
And it wouldn't have happened if the physical space hadn't been created in the first place. Which brings us to another massive finding from the Bogotá paper.
The unintended benefits.
Right. The researchers note that while the city government aimed for the 3 Rs, they stumbled into what the paper calls unanticipated gains.
Yes, the generation of social networks. And this is a crucial functional outcome.
How did that happen?
The researchers discovered that by simply bringing these isolated women out of their private homes and into a shared physical space, the city was generating massive amounts of social capital.
We love to romanticize the concept of the third place, right? You know, the cozy local cafe, the bustling public square, the corner pub. The idea that you have your first place, which is home,
Right.
your second place, which is work, and your third place for community. But this Bogotá research really shatters that sort of bourgeois ideal.
It completely deconstructs it.
Because for a marginalized, impoverished caregiver, a coffee shop isn't a third place. It's a commercial zone she's entirely priced out of. And her home is her workplace, so she doesn't even have a separation of first and second places.
That's a vital critique of how we view urban space. Caregiving, especially full-time unremunerated caregiving in low-income areas, causes severe social isolation. You are functionally trapped.
Yeah.
But at the care blocks, women started talking in the laundry room. They started studying together for their high school diplomas. One woman literally realized she was sitting next to her neighbor.
Mhm.
They had lived next to each other for years, separated only by a wall, but had never spoken.
Wait, really? Never spoken?
Never, because they were both so isolated by the unrelenting grind of their domestic duties.
Wow. So the physical space of the care block forced an encounter that years of geographical proximity couldn't achieve. The state literally built a bridging infrastructure.
And the fact that these women were so isolated wasn't just a byproduct of patriarchal gender norms.
Yeah.
It was heavily compounded by class and geography.
Right, the intersectional lens is crucial here.
Absolutely. The Alvarez-Rivadula research explicitly points out that caregiving in Bogotá is highly stratified by class.
So time poverty maps directly onto physical geography.
Exactly. More than half of all caregivers in the city are economically inactive, meaning they don't have formal paid jobs. And they tend to belong to the three lowest socioeconomic strata, what Bogotá classifies as estratos 1, 2, and 3.
And where are those strata located?
These are peripheral areas. They are often informal settlements that lack basic public services, lack paved roads, and lack decent transportation.
Right, so just getting around is a chore.
The physical environment itself makes the act of caring exponentially harder. Taking a child to a clinic isn't a 10-minute drive. It's a multi-hour ordeal on inadequate public transit.
So the lack of infrastructure is the crisis.
Exactly.
Now, I want to take this realization that physical infrastructure dictates who suffers and who connects, and travel about 8,500 miles away.
Let's go to Australia.
Yes, we are going to shift our focus to Sydney, using the research from Williams et al. 2026. Because while Bogotá shows us what happens when the state actively builds care infrastructure in marginalized areas.
Sydney shows us the inverse.
Exactly. Sydney, during the pandemic, shows us what happens when the state aggressively restricts it.
Right. The Williams paper examines the strict COVID-19 lockdowns in Sydney in 2020 and 2021, a prolonged period of restriction the authors refer to as pandemia.
And the core argument of this Sydney paper really shifted my perspective. Because we usually think of a public park or a sidewalk as just a backdrop.
Like a stage.
Yeah, it's the stage where life happens. But these researchers argue that public space is an active infrastructure of care in itself.
It is.
And when the pandemic hit and everyone was legally confined to their immediate neighborhoods, the deep historical structural inequities in who actually had access to this infrastructure were just brutally exposed.
To understand the weight of their findings, we really have to look at their methodology.
Oh, the autoethnography?
Yes. Unlike the broad, macro-level demographic studies of the pandemic that just look at, infection rates or hospitalization numbers, the Williams researchers used autoethnography. They used personal vignettes, small, subjective, deeply localized stories.
Wait, let's clarify autoethnography for the listener, meaning they weren't just standing with clipboards observing subjects from afar, right?
Right.
The researchers were documenting their own hyper-local personal survival tactics during the lockdown.
Yes, exactly. Because traditional sweeping sociology became physically impossible when everyone was locked in their homes. So the researchers turned to the hyper-local.
They looked inward.
The mundane, everyday interactions with ordinary places became the only observable universe. They wanted to show how a regular sidewalk or a patch of dirt became either a vital sanctuary or a zone of strict exclusion.
And just like in Bogotá, we see that exclusion maps perfectly onto class lines. The lockdown restrictions in Sydney weren't applied equally across the city, were they?
No, Sydney was deeply divided by the state government. There were specific LGAs of concern.
LGAs meaning local government areas.
Right. And these areas were subjected to much harsher, more punitive lockdown rules than the rest of the city. And as the researchers point out, these areas correlated strongly with historically higher concentrations of socioeconomic disadvantage, larger migrant populations, and higher housing density.
So the residents in these marginalized areas experienced slower vaccine rollouts. They historically had far poorer access to green spaces.
Yes.
And the public infrastructure they did have was poorly maintained. So while people in wealthy, leafy suburbs with large private backyards and home offices were I don't know, baking sourdough and doing yoga on their lawns.
Living a very different pandemic.
Exactly. People in dense, low-income areas were suffocating in small apartments with literally nowhere to go.
Which brings us to one of the most compelling vignettes from the Williams paper. It's an observation from a researcher named Narita, and it concerns a car park BBQ.
I love this story.
It perfectly illustrates what happens when formal public space is restricted and marginalized communities have to improvise their own infrastructures of care.
So set the scene for us.
So Narita observes a public housing complex. And because of pandemic health fears and strict government regulations, the tenants of this complex were locked out of their own indoor common room.
The state, acting as the manager of that space, just shut it down to prevent gathering.
Exactly. So what did the residents do? They claimed a drab, concrete car park. They dragged out chairs. They set up a BBQ. It wasn't a commodified space where you have to buy a $9 latte to sit down.
No, not at all.
It wasn't a lush, manicured green park. It was just concrete. But they transformed it into a space of survival and community care.
It demonstrates a vital concept for our feminist park blueprint, right? Public space isn't just about aesthetic beauty or manicured lawns. It's about the permission to gather.
That's the key. Permission.
For those public housing tenants, gathering was a psychological survival strategy. It was an act of mutual aid in a marginalized space. When the formal infrastructure of care, the common room, failed them or locked them out, they actively created an informal one.
And it highlights a critical difference in state action between our two cities. In Bogotá, the state proactively built a space, the care block, to bring marginalized people in.
Right.
In Sydney, the state locked marginalized people out of their spaces, forcing them to fend for themselves in a parking lot. It really makes you think about who controls the keys to community.
It really does. And that brings us to another deeply entrenched boundary that physical space either reinforces or dismantles. The boundary of nationality and race. Who gets to freely use public space is deeply tied to the migrant and racial justice perspective.
This is incredibly prevalent in the Bogotá research. Alvarez Rivadula et al. Specifically interviewed Venezuelan migrants utilizing the care blocks.
And let's give some context there because it's important. The paper notes that as of 2025, about 2.8 million Venezuelans were living in Colombia due to the ongoing economic and political crisis in their home country.
A massive displaced population.
Yeah, and they face extreme discrimination, xenophobia, a lack of access to health care, and immense struggles with legal documentation. They are a highly vulnerable population living on the very margins of the city.
But inside the walls of the care blocks, the researchers documented something remarkable: profound integration. The shared identity of being a caregiver actually superseded the highly stigmatized identity of being a migrant.
I have to read the exact quote from Respondent 17 because it is so powerful.
Oh, please do.
She is a 38-year-old migrant mother of 8 children, and back in Venezuela, she was a professional business administrator. But Colombia don't recognize her credentials, so she was forced to repeat high school at the care block just to get a basic local degree.
Which is humbling in itself.
Extremely. And she told the researchers, "I like that they allow us to integrate. Here, it doesn't matter whether you are a migrant, you are still a caregiver. They don't call me a migrant here, they call me a caregiver here. Here, I'm not just the Venezuelan, I'm simply a mom who needs support and wants to move forward."
Think about the mechanics of why that works. The physical infrastructure of the care block created a psychological safe zone.
Yes.
By focusing on the shared labor, the universal exhaustion of washing clothes and raising children, the space stripped away the macro-level societal prejudice. It connected people based on their shared physical reality.
So the care block acts as an infrastructural shield against the xenophobia of the broader city.
Exactly. But when we contrast that with Sydney, we see how state infrastructure can do the exact opposite. We see how the state can use the physical environment to enforce racial boundaries and criminalize movement.
Right.
The Williams paper observed that during the 2021 lockdowns, residents in Sydney's southwest were highly racialized and heavily targeted in public spaces.
And here again, we must rely strictly on how the researchers documented these events, just keeping our impartiality note in mind.
Of course.
Williams et al. Noted severe disparities in state policing. There are reports of police interrogating parents simply for letting their children play in their own front yards.
In their own yards.
Yeah. There were even soldiers and military helicopters patrolling the streets of Fairfield, which, for context, is a highly diverse working-class area with a large migrant population.
Imagine the psychological impact of that. We've established that going outside is a fundamental human need for care, right? But you step outside your door in Fairfield for a breath of air, and a military helicopter is hovering overhead.
Or a police officer is demanding your papers.
Right. The Williams paper frames this as a massive, violent barrier to free movement and care. The increased policing turned public space from a site of relief into a site of fear, surveillance, and intimidation.
It reinforced the fragility of the right to freely occupy public space if you belong to a marginalized group.
This raises an essential question for our feminist park design. If infrastructure dictates who gives and receives care, how complicit is our city planning and our law enforcement in maintaining inequality?
That's the million-dollar question.
In Sydney's southwest, the infrastructure of the state was deployed to surveil and restrict rather than to support. It proved that public space is highly contested territory. It is not inherently safe just because it is outdoors.
It really is contested territory. And that leads us to look at another invisible boundary that urban design can either fortify or erase. Let's look at the queer theory perspective, specifically regarding non-normative uses of space.
This is a fascinating angle from the Bogotá research. The Alvarez-Rivadula paper looked specifically at the Los Martires care block.
Tell us about that neighborhood.
Well, this particular facility is located in the city center, which is a historically impoverished area known for high levels of informal commerce, drug use, prostitution, and an extremely diverse, non-traditional street population.
Okay, normally if a city is building a shiny new family community center, they try to sanitize the location, right? They put it in a safe, quiet, quote-unquote traditional neighborhood.
Exactly.
But Bogotá put it right in the middle of a complex, gritty, highly stigmatized urban center. And the researchers found that this had a profound effect. It created what they call fluid encounters.
Yes, and the underlying mechanism here is grounded in contact theory.
Explain that for us.
When you design a vital public service that everyone desperately needs, like a free laundry machine or free education, you bring vastly different types of people into the exact same room. You break down the invisible walls of segregated neighborhoods. You force proximity.
Oh, I see. There's a brilliant story about respondent 16 that touches on this. She's a woman in her late 50s, an informal street entrepreneur, and she is the full-time caregiver for her husband who has a physical disability.
Right.
She admitted to the researchers that she used to be very reserved, very traditional in her worldview. But the Los Martires block serves a large LGBTQI+ population who live and work in that area.
And they were all using the same space.
Yes. And she told the researchers, let's not forget that there is a lot of LGBTQI+ population around here, and it has been good to interact with them. I used to be very reserved before, but not anymore. I have learned, I have met people. With my friends, we enter the care block and share without any problems.
The researchers use the term thrown togetherness to describe this.
Thrown togetherness, I like that.
It's perfect. Forced proximity in a shared utility space breaks down prejudice far more effectively than any public awareness campaign or lecture could.
Because it's lived experience.
Exactly. When an older traditional caregiver and a young queer person are both waiting for their laundry to finish in the same room, they are forced to share space. The shared vulnerability of needing the state's infrastructure forces them to realize they are both just humans trying to survive the city.
The infrastructure itself, by being radically inclusive, fosters tolerance. Thrown togetherness. It's the messy, beautiful reality of urban life when it is actually allowed to function without hyper-policing. But, you know, as with all policies, even the most progressive ones have blind spots.
They always do.
If we are designing the feminist park, we have to look at where these systems fail. And we need to look at the ableism and disability justice perspective to see who is still being left out of the blueprint.
The Bogotá policy, as groundbreaking and internationally lauded as it is, has a critical flaw that the researchers explicitly identify.
What is it?
The care blocks provide wonderful professional respite care, but only for children aged 1 to 12.
Wow. Which completely ignores a massive, largely invisible segment of the caregiving population.
Entirely.
What about the woman who is a full-time caregiver for her adult son with a severe autism?
Oh.
Or the woman caring for her disabled husband, like respondent 16? Or a daughter who has had to quit her job to care for an elderly parent with advanced dementia?
The Alvarez-Rivadula researchers found that these women are effectively abandoned by the respite services. If they want to attend a class or do their laundry at the care block, they still have to privately, exhaustingly organize care for their adult dependents just to be able to leave the house for an hour.
That defeats the whole purpose of the relief system.
Exactly. The state policy implicitly decided that only the care of young, presumably neurotypical or physically able children was a burden worth lifting. The care of disabled adults was pushed right back into the private, invisible sphere.
That is a heartbreaking oversight. It means the absolute most isolated caregivers, those caring for adults with severe needs, are still entirely isolated. The system wasn't designed to hold them.
No, it wasn't.
And the Williams paper from Sydney touches on this reality, too, regarding how people's needs for public space vary wildly across the life course.
Yes. The Sydney vignettes emphasize that the physical need for public space is not uniform. During the pandemic, if you were young, able-bodied, and neurotypical, you could jog 5 miles away to find an open, uncrowded park. You could navigate the restrictions physically.
Right. You had options.
But if you had mobility issues, or if you were elderly and relied on the specific bench at the end of your street, and that bench was suddenly taped off with police tape, you had literally nowhere to go.
It proves that a one-size-fits-all urban design inherently excludes the disabled and the elderly. If your park requires walking down a steep hill, or if your community center doesn't have adult changing tables, you aren't just forgetting a demographic.
No, you're building active exclusion into the concrete.
You are telling them they do not belong in public.
Which brings us perfectly to the ultimate goal of our deep dive today. We've seen the systemic successes and the critical blind spots in Bogotá's care blocks. We've seen the desperation, the racialized policing, and the geographic inequity in pandemic-era Sydney.
Let's bring all of this to the drafting table.
Let's do it.
How do we synthesize a Colombian district care system and an Australian lockdown autoethnography to design the feminist park? If we were handed a blank blueprint today and told to design a physical public space for liberation, equity, and care, what are the actual non-negotiable features?
Well, based on the data from these two papers, the first and most vital principle is that the feminist park must radically transcend the traditional patriarchal idea of mere green space.
Right, a patch of grass, a swing set, and a walking path is not enough.
Exactly. Drawing on Bogotá, the park must actively incorporate functional infrastructures of care.
Yes, it cannot just be a place of leisure that you are only allowed to visit after your exhausting domestic chores are done. It has to be a place that actively helps you do your chores.
Precisely.
The park needs heavy physical utilities built right into the landscape. So feature number 1 isn't a gazebo. It's a fully functional, state-subsidized utility hub. Imagine a beautiful, open-air, solar-powered communal laundry facility. Right next to it is a flexible education space with free Wi-Fi and computers.
And crucially, addressing Bogotá's blind spot, it must feature safe, inclusive, professionally staffed care centers for both children and disabled adults. By moving the heavy infrastructure of the private home into the public natural sphere, you are physically reducing the domestic burden.
I love that. And drawing on the lessons from Sydney, the aesthetic design of the feminist park must embrace what geographers call in-between spaces.
Explain that a bit more.
Well, the Williams paper features a beautiful vignette from a researcher named Harriet, who walked along the Cooks River during lockdown. She didn't write about pristine, manicured gardens. She noticed the rubbish, the wild myna birds, the makeshift dirt tracks carved out by people just trying to find a quiet place to walk.
The lesson there is that the feminist park doesn't need to have strict, heavily managed, manicured boundaries. It should recognize that car parks, alleyways, and riverbanks are legitimate organic zones of care.
They require municipal maintenance and aesthetic respect, sure, but they do not require intense surveillance or policing.
It's about recognizing that people will organically make community wherever they are permitted to exist. Narita's Car Park BBQ proves that marginalized people don't need the state to teach them how to gather. They just need the state to stop locking the doors and sending helicopters.
Exactly. So instead of putting up hostile architecture like those spikes to stop unhoused people from sitting, the feminist park designs for loitering.
Yes.
It designs for lingering. It provides the wide seating, the shade structures, the public BBQs, the accessible bathrooms, without ever requiring anyone to buy a commodity to justify their presence.
And we have hard scientific validation that this infrastructural approach works. The Alvarez-Rivadula paper explicitly concludes that place-based interventions are more likely to succeed than people-based ones.
Oh, that's a great point.
You cannot just tell impoverished caregivers to be less isolated. You cannot just hand them a pamphlet on mental health. You have to physically build the space that forces the connection. Constructing a tangible feminist park is scientifically backed as a method to generate social capital.
But we have to be realistic about the threats to this space, too. We've seen the pitfalls in the research. How do we prevent this beautiful feminist park from being co-opted, over-policed, and militarized like Sydney Southwest was during the lockdowns?
It's a real danger.
How do we ensure that it doesn't just trigger gentrification, becoming a playground for the wealthy that pushes the marginalized further into the periphery?
It requires a radical shift in urban governance. The synthesis of these papers suggests that the feminist park cannot just be dropped into a neighborhood by a distant city council. It must be co-managed by the community itself.
It has to be designed specifically for those fluid encounters and thrown togetherness we discussed.
Yes, actively dismantling the borders between the housed and unhoused, the migrant and the citizen, the disabled and the able-bodied.
And it has to foster a being in common, not just among humans, but with the environment itself. Bronwyn, one of the authors of the Sydney paper, wrote these amazing autoethnographic haikus during lockdown about watching the wild birds thrive outside while humans were trapped inside.
I remember this.
She wrote about feeling the sun on her wild pink eyelids. The feminist park has to be an ecosystem of care where the human world and the more than human world are allowed to coexist safely without the constant drive for economic productivity.
It fundamentally requires moving away from the capitalist framework that views the city merely as a machine for economic output and returning to viewing the city as a habitat for human beings.
So as we pull back and look at the whole picture today, we've covered a massive amount of conceptual ground, from the high-altitude, state-sponsored care blocks of Colombia to the hyper-policed, lockdown concrete spaces of Australia.
That's a lot to process.
And the core truth that emerges from both of these studies is undeniable. Care is not just an innate biological characteristic. It's not just a private, invisible gift that a mother gives her child behind closed doors.
No, care is labor. It is a fundamental, physically demanding, life-sustaining infrastructure. And just like a city's train line or its water grid, care requires physical space and massive societal investment to function.
And when we force individuals to do it entirely alone, isolated in under-resourced private homes, we are crushing them under the weight of it.
Whether you are fighting the profound, unnatural isolation of a global pandemic, or the quiet, relentless daily grind of unpaid domestic work, accessible, unpoliced public space is the antidote.
It is the literal bridge back to humanity.
I want to turn this over to you, the listener, right now. Think critically about your own neighborhood. Where are your infrastructural bridges? Are there spaces within a 10-minute walk of your home where you can go to sit, to rest, to gather, without having to spend a single dollar?
And more importantly, look closely at who is utilizing those spaces. Are they designed to support the marginalized, the elderly, the disabled? Or are they built with invisible, hostile walls designed to exclude anyone who doesn't fit the aesthetic?
Look at the design details, Are there metal armrests strategically placed in the middle of public benches, specifically so unhoused people cannot sleep there? Is the nearest public bathroom permanently locked or entirely non-existent? Is there a curb cut for a wheelchair or just a steep step?
This raises the most important question of all. If physical infrastructure dictates who is allowed to give and receive care, how complicit is our own city planning in maintaining systemic inequality?
That heavy thought.
Every single time a city council approves a luxury condo development without mandating public green space, or cuts funding to a local public library, or increases police patrols in a minority neighborhood, they are making a conscious spatial choice about who deserves care and who does not.
It's a necessary realization, though.
It is. But before we sign off, I want to leave you with a final, slightly provocative thought to mull over. Something to actively explore on your own as you navigate your city this week.
Okay, let's hear it.
Imagine if tomorrow you were tasked with mapping your daily commute, not by the fastest geographical route and not by the most scenic route, but exclusively by the safest zones of care.
Wow. That would draw a completely different map of the city for almost everyone.
Exactly. If you had to draw a path from your home to your workplace based only on places where you felt entirely welcomed, supported, unsurveilled, and free to linger, would you have to drastically change your path?
Most people definitely would.
Think about how many invisible boundaries you cross every single day without even noticing them, simply because they weren't designed to keep you out. What if your city wasn't a series of commercial checkpoints, but a healthy, interconnected nervous system where every single synapse was firing to support the well-being of its most vulnerable residents?
That's a powerful vision.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We hope it makes you look at the concrete, the laundromats, and the parks a little differently differently tomorrow. Keep questioning the unseen spaces around you. We'll see you next time.
This knowledge is a tool, really. A tool for seeing your city differently, and potentially for helping to change it.
It's been a really insightful deep dive, I think. This document provides such a vital framework, especially for projects like the Feminist Park Project that are trying to build something fundamentally different. It shows just how interlinked urban design and social justice are.
It really does. But it also shows the scale of the challenge, right? It requires sustained effort, real commitment, and a genuine willingness to shift power dynamics in how cities get made and managed.
Definitely. It makes you think about how we ensure those voices, the ones that have been excluded, are actually heard and centered.
There's another quote from Sarah Ahmed that feels relevant here.
Go on.
She says, "If you have to shout to be heard, you are heard as shouting."
That's powerful.
It makes you ponder, doesn't it? How can the design of public space itself work differently? How can it amplify the voices of those who've been historically silenced, ensuring their needs are met without them having to shout just to be noticed?
How can design itself listen? That's a really provocative thought to end on.
A lot to think about.
Indeed. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.